This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is Steven Soderbergh's film, The Limey, and whether it is great or not, I have two returning guests, Donato Totaro and Gordon Briggs, and they will be discussing the merits of the film. Steven Soderbergh's film, The Limey, is the subject. I have two guests who will be speaking about it. They've both appeared before a few years ago. Donato Totaro did a couple of film shows with me, and Gordon Briggs has been a semi-regular on this. This is, I think, his fifth, maybe sixth, fifth, at least fifth, four. Okay, so this is number 5 then. Before we get into the film, I'd like to give my guests a little bit of a time to tell about themselves. So let me start with Donato on the left. If you could give a little background about who you are, what you do, and your opening volleys about The Limey.
Good day, all. My name is Donato Totaro. I'm also a faculty member at Concordia University here in Montreal, Canada, in the cinema department. And I'm also, I think I dedicate as much time, if not more, to my sort of sidekick habit, which is an online magazine called Off Screen, which has been running, hard to believe, since 1997. It's the longest running monthly film journal. So it's monthly. There's 5 new articles a month. And I actually did an article on The Limey. I'm imagining that's probably why Dan has kind of picked me up on this. And I was actually a little bit, I wasn't sure it was today, so I'm not super prepared, but I've seen this film at least 10 times. I saw it last year, the last time, which was when I taught it. And I'll just say a few words, I guess, on the film in terms of why I think it's such an important film. I show it in the context of a class on editing, so montage theory. And the thing about this film that makes it so innovative is that it's actually a very conventional film otherwise. And when you know the production history, they sort of conceived it and basically scripted it as a fairly conventional revenge gangster film because they were popular at that time in the UK. And then him and the screenwriter Dobbs started to think about what can we do to sort of make this feel a bit less conventional, and they just basically gave it this cubistic structural form, or they just made it completely non-linear, but it's actually still a very coherent and very easy to follow film. So to me, I'm fascinated by the way it's able to sort of be interesting for mainstream audiences and also be very interesting for people that are more interested in more difficult formal cinema. So it's complex, like structurally, but it's actually very easy to follow. And I think that I can't think of too many films that do that.
Gordon, if you could give a little background about who you are and your opening thoughts on the film.
Hi, I'm Gordon Briggs. I'm an instructor at the University of Rio Grande. I teach art and writing. But I also review films on Facebook. If you look me up, Gordon Briggs, I'll give you 2 film reviews every day for the rest of your life. Anyway, my first experience with The Limey was in 1999. I actually caught it on VHS. I had not seen it in theaters. And I'll agree with the Nile. It's a pretty standard revenge film. I remember this incredible scene where he goes to intimidate people at a warehouse. He gets beaten up and is left out on the street. And in an unbroken shot, we just see him walk back into that warehouse. You hear guns go off, and you see people running out the warehouse. Then the camera just zooms in on his face, and he goes, "You tell him I'm coming. Tell him I'm freaking coming." And you're like, okay, what film is this? I want to see the rest of the film. So what grabbed me there? It's the opening thing. I'll agree with everything that was previously said. I also think The Limey is a great film about the 60s. It's a movie about the 1990s that's very much in dialogue, not only with the films of the 60s, but kind of interrogating the whole idea of the 60s counterculture. And that's one of the reasons I think it's a great film.
Well, we got a little background feedback there. One of the things with the film is it uses something very unique that I think I've read has only been done 2 or 3 times in other films, and that is use a prior film that wasn't made by the filmmaker as sort of a flashback. And we're talking about a film called Poor Cow, which was made, I think, 30 years earlier. And we, I guess, ought to presume that this is a continuation of that or a sort of sideways sequel. Let me start with you, Gordon. Do you know of any other film that does this? Because like I said, I've read that it's only been done 2 or 3 times, but I don't know other films.
You know, I kept thinking about it. It's like, I know there are films where characters from other movies will pop up in different movies. I think Michael Keaton's character from Jackie Brown shows up in Out of Sight because they're supposed to be taking place in the same universe. I know other characters from different movies have shown up. I'm not sure I've ever seen, and as soon as I finish this, I'm gonna be like, oh, I should have said that one. But I cannot think of anyone from a previous film that shows up in a completely different movie to play the same character 60 years on. I'm almost tempted now just to Google if it's happened before. I can't think of one now.
How about you, Donato? Are the films sort of connected?
Yeah, it's a tough question because I'm sure there is. There's obviously filmmakers that have used their own work, like Bergman has in the opening of Persona.
Yeah.
He's got snippets of of Winter Light and Through a Glass Darkly in the opening montage. So there's directors who do that. But to do it exactly the way that Steven Soderbergh has done it, I'm not quite sure. Although it's never actually clearly stated that it is the same character. That's not. It's sort of, we imply that because of it is the same actor, but it isn't really necessarily the same character. It's not scripted to be the same character. We just infer that.
Yeah.
I have one. I have one.
Go ahead.
Okay.
I just Googled the 2 characters from Trading Places show up in Coming to America as 2 homeless guys. Okay. If you've seen Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, the 2 villains from Trading Places show up in Coming to America. Other than that, I cannot think of it.
Do they show up in the remake of Coming to America? Or
no. No one should have shown up for that one.
Yeah, right.
So, but as you said, Donato, basically you don't really need to know that. It's just a nice sort of, it's sort of like a little bon mot to the fans of this actor, Terence Stamp, because Terence Stamp was a huge actor in 1960s British cinema, which gets back to Gordon's point. So we do get this guy named Wilson. We just know him as Wilson, and he's sort of on a mission to come after this sleazy sort of record producer, media guy, played by, of all people, Peter Fonda, who was sort of the ultimate outsider when he burst onto the scene. What we got there, Donato? Oh, you put. I thought maybe you had a Peter Fonda.
I got my window open. It's a bit chilly.
Oh, okay. So let me then start with you, Gordon. You talked about seeing that famous scene when he's raging. I think he's got a little blood on his face or whatnot. The introduction to Wilson, though, is a little bit more sedate there, and it takes a while for us to get the story, to meet the sort of hangers-on that know about his daughter and what may or may not have happened to her. Talk about the opening there and how it sets up the character of Wilson as the protagonist or antagonist.
Well, it depends on how you look at it. If I remember this movie, it's hard to remember how I felt about the first time, but I think The Limey is a movie you have to go back and look at several times to get, because it starts with Wilson on a plane, and it just kind of, well, even before that, the screen is black, and you have this line where he says, tell me about Jenny. So the first few minutes of the movie are just these fragments, these clips of different things, and you're wondering who this guy is, why this person of Jenny is there. And then the movie opens with, is it The Who? Who sing? Yeah, okay. I know my 1960s pop culture. The Who singing The Seeker. So there's a kind of double thing going on there where he is seeking someone and the soundtrack of the movie is playing The Seeker. So when the movie first starts, I got the sense that we were looking almost like what Nicholas Roeg used to do in his movies, which is taking a movie and chopping it up into pieces, and you have to sort of assemble it right there. But I do remember Terrence Stamp coming across as an outsider. And I think one of the things that works about this movie is that not only is the movie kind of temporally out of order, but he's kind of out of place.
Yeah.
He is a British person in America. He's an older guy in a crime story, and he's just someone who's out of place. That's what I thought.
Donato, is the whole film told in flashback? Is that opening shot where we see him on the plane, is that him coming or going?
Either way works. There's no way to be definitive about that. You could read it that it's a flash forward or it's a flashback. So when you see in the plane, it's either already happened, the whole events that we're seeing, or it's about to happen. And I think it's structured. That's the genius of the film, is that it's structured on the tip of the fence. It doesn't fall one way or the other. Really, there's no indicators to tell you one or the other definitively. Because even when the things he says to the woman, oh yeah, I was away up north. I got off early for good time. Everything could be read sort of in more than one way, so that he could be talking about his prison time. He could be talking about just being away working on an oil rig, I think it was.
Yeah.
So that's the genius of the film, is that it's impossible to say one or the other. It doesn't really make a difference either to your enjoyment of the film.
Yeah,
It could work either way.
Yeah.
I was just looking at something the other day, and in a sense, the film that this most reminds me of is sort of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in that you have Terry Valentine as sort of Angel Eyes, the bad. You have Louis Guzman as sort of what is it?
Eli Wallach's character.
Yeah,
The
Eli,
Ugly.
what? Yeah, right. The Ugly. What was the character's name?
Tuco.
Right, Tuco. And then you have Wilson cast as Blondie in the Eastwood role, because the only difference really is that Guzman is sort of he's more faithful than Tuco is, but it's odd because it seems it's quite similar in that they're both going after this bad guy and his cronies. Do you think there was anything, since that was a great '60s film? Do you think in any way that affected Soderbergh? Because I only made that connection just a day or two ago when I just was, in thinking of this film and then just seeing a video online about Good, Bad, and Ugly.
The movie that I can see that connection between Good, Bad, and Ugly. The movie, Denial, I don't know if you've seen this movie. It reminded me a lot of Point Blank. If any of you have seen Point Blank, the John Borman film starring Lee Marvin, it reminded me a lot because it is about this sort of seasoned veteran criminal who's coming into a world of criminals. And, one of the themes of Point Blank is Lee Marvin's character really there, or is he not really there? And it just kind of reminded me of this outsider coming into the city. The Los Angeles setting, I don't know how familiar you guys are with Robert Altman. It reminded me a little bit of The Long Goodbye. I don't know if you've seen The Long Goodbye, but it did kind of remind me of this kind of person who almost seems to be coming in from a different film genre. Like he's coming in from a British gangster film, and all of a sudden he's in LA. So it did remind me of those other films. Like I said before, this movie is about memory.
Yeah.
It's about memory.
The Long Goodbye with Elliot Gould, that's the film?
Yeah. It was kind of similar to that, and that they're both noirs that have to take place in LA. Yeah. There's no other place that could take place other than LA, which is ironic because LA is the capital of show business. Yeah. It's where movies are set. So.
Yeah, the thing, Point Blank, I've seen it, and it's definitely a touchstone for Soderbergh. And the interesting thing about Point Blank is that there's ambiguity there too, because in the film we're not quite sure whether the character who is shot actually is dead. So is this his memory, his dying embers of his life that we're seeing, or is it actually did he survive the shot?
And I'm thinking that the Limey has this because if he's returning back at the start of the movie, and the whole movie is just him remembering something that's already happened. And the crux, we don't want to give away the ending just yet, but the crux or the climax of this movie is an evocation of a memory that the bad guy has, which is very similar to the memory that Terrence Stamp has. So it's an interesting movie about not only the past and about how time works. It's a movie about how do we make sense of it? How do you assemble it all? And the viewer has to do that for themselves.
Yeah. And go ahead, Donald.
No, and within that, I mean, you're right, Gordon, in terms of it being about memory, but it's the 60s, you say, but it's also about regret, which is connected to the 60s, right? Both the Peter Fonda character and the Limey character. Well, what's interesting about it is that he's just obsessed with this revenge. He's the seeker. He's got to get the bad people that murdered, indirectly, inadvertently murdered his daughter. But then when it's there in front of him, he can't do it. You know, he realizes that's not going to solve anything. If I kill this guy, we're both destroyed, fractured male father / figures that are just, you know, we're both symbols of something lost, and so he has this redemption at the end when he doesn't kill the Fonda character, which is kind of a surprise, I think, because most revenge films would have the person kill him, and maybe that's what the audience wants. But he doesn't give us that easy, raw feel at the end of the film.
Yeah.
What did you think, Gordon? At the end, did you think he was going to kill?
A couple things. One is looking at the film again, you realize how smart the Limey is with its revenge as compared to something like, say, the Liam Neeson movies that come out nowadays.
Yeah.
You know, I have a certain set of skills. I want to kill everybody. And I thought what gave the film emotional impact was you realize that Peter Fonda and Terrence Stamp are kind of reflections of the same person.
Yes.
They're reflections of the same person. And him not killing this guy is, well, we can just talk about it now. There's this movie where his daughter would threaten to report him to the police. Terrence Stamp would threaten to report her father to the police. She goes and finds another father figure in Peter Fonda, finds out he's illegally dealing drugs. She threatens to tells the police on him, and he kills her. So he realizes that the motivation for his daughter's death is a reflection of her relationship with him.
Yeah.
So I think that moment of realization, which is visually shown as very kaleidoscopic, there's a light shining on the person's face.
Yeah.
It has more impact as you realize that in a roundabout way, his criminal behavior is responsible for his daughter's death. So it became more satisfying then. Also, I like that shootout at the end because Terrence Stamp doesn't actually shoot anybody. It's just two series of bad guys taking each other out. And it's almost like, oh, he's supposed to be this killer. These guys are doing all this stuff themselves. They don't have to do anything. So I thought that was fun.
I want to just get back to the idea about whether or not it happened or not, because when you just mentioned, Gordon, about the sort of father fixation of the character that we only see glimpses in memory of, I was thinking that, well, if you take the fact that how easily Wilson makes allies, and these people have to know that he's a bad guy, he basically says he's an ex-con, you know, he's committing mayhem here and there, and also that he goes Rambo, and he's not the big muscular action hero. He's a 55, 60-year-old guy who's you know just gotten out of jail in a foreign country, and so there seems to be an element of sort of this Hollywood macho mythos that this older guy who you would never see in any other kind of action kind of film going Rambo is doing this. And so I'm thinking that at the end, it makes sense that this is sort of his fantasy, and then he can maybe can correct his own his own self, his own action in his mind at the end by not killing
Oh,
him. So I'm just wondering, what do you
so
think
you're
about it?
thinking that maybe this is not even happening, that maybe he did kill the guy?
Well, no, that maybe the whole thing had happened generally, but it's more gussied up to make him look more favorable to himself
Oh,
because
okay.
I don't know.
Hmm. I, I,
Well,
I didn't I didn't think of, what do you think, Donato? I didn't think about that.
no, I mean, what would be gained from that? I don't,
No.
man, because I think there are actually older He-Men that pop up all the time in Hollywood. You know, Clint Eastwood is still tough in his in Gran Torino. He's like pushing 85. He's still, he's still tough.
And Cry Macho he is too.
I haven't
Um,
seen that yet, but you look George C. Scott in what's it called? The one that's the Searchers, hardcore. Where he
Hardcore,
goes,
yeah.
he has to save his daughter from the pimps. He's middle aged, so there's a lot of older middle aged men, completely unrealistically, that are super tough, and so I don't think he's
Well,
that unusual in that sense.
to your point, Dan, I do think that there is a critique that Soderbergh and Dobbs may be making of manhood and masculinity through their female characters. I think one of the interesting things here is Leslie Ann Warren's presence in this movie. First of all, I just love Leslie Ann Warren. I've always loved Leslie Ann Warren ever since Victoria and Clue. But she has this line where Limey, Terrence Stamp wants to come in and kill these guys and for what they did to his daughter, and she just says, "Oh, you guys with your dicks."
Dicks, yeah.
It's such a subtle line, but it's just like, man, this is what we've seen in 10,000 movies before. The guy dressed in dark clothes who goes around killing people, and it's just like, what do you think that's going to solve? That's not going to solve anything. And at the end, she's right. You do see those other characters are the two bumbling hitmen who think they're that guy. Wilson actually is that guy. And so I think there is kind of like an inherent critique of the traditional Hollywood revenge film, which is why I think it's so important that the movie takes place, around the peripheries of show business. That the movie is just as much about how we sell and how we market violence to people as much as it is about real violence. Well,
Yeah.
I remember The Limey was not a financial success when it came out. It kind of gained an audience on DVD. So I think there might be people going to the theater saying, "Oh, I'm going to see, this revenge film," and it's not really bad at all.
Well, yeah, and like you said, we'll just pick up right there. Like you said, or Donato said, it is a fairly standard film, except revenge film, except in one way. This film, I think, is far more a character study than it is a revenge film. Because if you look at all the characters, I mean, how well sketched are they? You mentioned Leslie Ann Warren, Louis Guzman's character. Compared him to Tuco, and while Tuco is a fun character, he's not particularly deep. You get a sense that you could meet a real Louis Guzman's character, Eduardo, rather than a Tuco. There are the Terry Valentines of the world, which is the Fonda character. They're abundant, and even these sort of bumbling hitmen, while they're bumbling, they're not quite as over the top as they would have been in a Tarantino movie. You can believe that they are that way. So let's talk about the film a little bit from the sense of a character study, not only of Wilson but these other characters, rather than the revenge aspect. I don't know if we want to start with Louis Guzman's character. Donato, do you have anything to go with?
Well, Guzman's actually the only one that, in a sense, doesn't fit into the design, the production design, the casting design of the film, because it's clear that Soderbergh was going after iconic 60s personalities and that had a very specific persona in the 60s. So Barry Newman, Joe D'Alessandro, Peter Fonda, of course, and Stamp, all those characters form that core 60s, both American and European, because they both worked in America and in Europe. Whereas Guzman is, he's out of that persona, but I think his relationship with the Valentine character is just so, it's both giving into those kind of conventions of homoeroticism or homosocial world, where like the prison world, where they're, your mates and sharing, when they share that cigarette together, and when we're able to exchange the cigarette and he accepts it. It's such a beautiful moment. It really is. So I think he's a wonderful character, because he somehow connects. The Limey character goes to his house and sees where he's living, he sort of intuitively understands that he's same class, because in Britain, the class system is just endemic, right? Whereas in the U.S., they tend to not believe that they're living in a class system. Canada, we're kind of in between in Canada. So I think he automatically understands that this guy's my bloke. He's my level. He's my class, and so they get along smashingly. So I think that's what's, to me, really touching and beautiful with the Guzman character and the Limey. They don't need much time to connect. They connect. But the other actors, I think they're all, like I said, like Joe D'Alessandro is to me, he was what a perfect cast, because he represents for me both. He worked with Warhol. He was in the factory, so he was, he made these really cutting edge, what we would now deem pornographic films, but art films. So he did films that were completely art films. But then he turns around and he goes to Italy and he stars in a bunch of these really fairly middle to low budget to high budget Italian crime films, the Politeschi's. And there were like really some brutal films. He played some really brutal, mean characters there. So he played in horror films, in of course the Antonio Margheriti films, Dracula and Frankenstein. He was in those two in the late 70s. The 3D Frankenstein, co-directed by Paul Morrissey and Margheriti. So he has this cachet of both art films, really rarefied art cinema, like Andy Warhol, structural cinema, kind of art pornography, and then he's got these popular, really sleazy popular films. So he really represents what the film is about as well. Is it's this avant-garde modernist film, but it's also this very popular genre film. So to me, Joe D'Alessandro was just a fantastic selection. You couldn't think of someone better than him. So I'll give it over to Gordon, because I'm being rambling a bit too much about Joe.
No. I was just watching Paul Morrissey's stuff, so yeah, I love his Frankenstein. Anyway, as far as Luis Guzman goes, I think that he is such a great character actor in general, but I think part of the juice of this movie is that relationship between Guzman and Stamp. That this movie is only about 80-something minutes long, and it starts right away. And I don't want to call him comic relief, because that skips what's going on here. I think that the comparison I use is when Anton Fuqua was talking about Training Day, the Denzel Washington, Ethan Hawke movie. He says that Ethan Hawke is the most important character in the movie because he's the audience for Denzel Washington's performance. I think that Luis Guzman is kind of like the audience. Yeah. And they're the person who knows what's going on. They're in the proper time frame. This is their community. And it's like, oh, if you want a great scene, look at that scene where him and Guzman go to the guy's house. They go to Peter Fonda's house. Peter Fonda has the binoculars, and in his Cockney slang, he goes, he's brought in the heavy mob. He's brought in bodyguards, and he's like, let me see that. Those aren't bodyguards, those are valets. It's just that contrast between, British slang and the actual thing that I think provides some humor. When they go to Peter Fonda's house, he's like, what do we think we're standing on? And Luis Guzman goes, hope. And there's this whole idea that Luis Guzman is a real person who has to, he's necessary, he's crucial to have someone for Terrence Stamp to bounce off of.
Yeah.
Just like regular old boring white guy Ethan Hawke is necessary for Denzel Washington to bounce off of in Training Day. He is necessary to bounce off of, and I love the touch. I love the touch where they say that Guzman had spent some time in prison, but where did he and his daughter meet? oh, we met in acting class. We met in acting class. It's such a nice little LA moment that, oh, of course you meet in acting class. So I think that Luis Guzman is important for the character of Wilson, but he's also important for the audience to grab onto. If you think of Wilson as Don Quixote,
Yeah.
if you think of Wilson as Don Quixote, then what's Don Quixote's companion's name?
Sancho Panza.
Sancho.
Yeah. He's kind of like that. He's okay. If you're gonna go on this journey, I will be your valid companion that will help you go on this journey and help you slay that giant.
Yeah, I think that I was going to say that too. That he's the audience because look at when he first sees Wilson doing violence and what he has that bug-eyed look like, holy cow, this is like from a movie.
Yeah. It's such smart writing by Lim Dobbs.
Yeah.
So many writers don't put a character like that in there. It's like, no, you need someone for your hero to bounce off of. You need someone there. As far as characterization goes, I thought that I wanted to get your guys' opinion about this. Peter Fonda is the antagonist here, but is he a bad guy? I mean, he committed murder, so I guess he is a bad guy. They go through such trouble to show you how kind of nice Peter. It's difficult to dislike Peter Fonda in this movie. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Well, I would want to pick up on that because you're talking about Barry Newman and the Fonda character. Yeah, if you go with the Quixote Sancho Panza thing, to me, Newman is sort of the Rasputin to Fonda's Tsar, because Fonda, he's almost like the front man. It's hard to believe because. Not that he's kind of fey, but he's kind of wishy-washy. He's kind of like, it's hard to believe that if he didn't have any money that he could attract, a young girl like Stamp's daughter. But then you get Barry Newman. He's the guy who's the hammer. He's the protector. He's sort of the power behind the throne. And if you fuck with Terry Valentine, you're fucking with me. And he's the guy who makes the calls and says, let's take care of these fuckers, So they're sort of the balance of the two guys, Stamp and Guzman, and then you have these two guys. So if you want to talk maybe, Donato, maybe about the relationship between the Barry Newman and the Fonda characters.
Yeah, I remember I think it was on the commentary track, which I haven't listened to in a while, but they referred to him as a certain, like what his job is, his position is it the
security?
Yeah. Securities? Yeah, that is
security specialist. I can't remember.
Yeah. Yeah, which apparently is an actual real thing in LA, but nowhere else. I think because you have people that are kind of have their hands in so many different pots, and the legal system and the way people are suing people left and right. So you have to have someone to make sure you're on the line between legality and illegality. So, but we look at him as a sort of a tough guy, almost like a confidant or Robert Duvall in The Godfather, like the lawyer who keeps everything on the up and up. But he's the mean guy. He's the one who sort of covers up and does all the dirty work for Valentine. So Valentine, who comes from the similar generation, but Valentine comes from this. We only had 66, the summer of love. So for him, he's exploiting that sense of urgent nostalgia that we all want to go back to. So he's running with that, whereas he's got the Newman character who is basically covering up all the dirt and cleaning the dirt from under his nails that we don't see. So they sort of thrive off of each other. And even though we don't like the Newman character, and as Gordon says, we sort of like the Terry Valentine character, they're really in the same boat, right? They morally there's not a whole lot to choose between them. So they complement each other. They're like yin and yang, or the dirt on the clean suit is the Barry Newman character.
Yeah. Gordon, what's your take on those two, sort of the opposite of the Stamp and Guzman characters?
Oh, I think it's an interesting dynamic because the movie is loaded up with these pairs. You have the two, even the hitman who they hired has a little sidekick. Luis Guzman could be Wilson's sidekick, and Newman could be like the Mr. Smithers. to Peter Fonda's Mr. Burns. What I thought is interesting is the dynamic between them, where Peter Fonda is someone who does not consider himself to be an evil person, but has clearly done evil. And Barry Newman is the guy who is his henchman, is the person that allows him to have this sort of beautiful life by doing evil. So I think that he's almost like his arm or his hand. He's the person that does evil that allows him to be legitimate. He is like Tom Hagen in that way, The Godfather.
Yeah, but as you said, that's a critique, right? That's definitely a critique that Soderbergh is offering to this the civility.
Yeah. It's a shame because the Lem Dobbs commentary with Soderbergh is so crucial, because Lem Dobbs had a much more ambitious script, which has Anne Margaret in it. And Anne Margaret gives this monologue, which you can read online, about how Peter Fonda's character was just a pot-smoking hippie who decided to start selling pot. And how he was making music, then decided to produce music, and how he wanted to have a good time, but instead became a drug dealer, and now we all have to have security guards around us. So there's a backstory there that maybe wasn't in the original film, where Barry Newman's character is there for several years because he used to be this drug-loving hippie who has now become a drug dealer who needs security around him to manage things.
Yeah.
If I can interject, this reminded me of something. I've never made this connection before, but the way you framed the Terry Valentine character made me remember. I don't know if you're familiar with a classic French film from 1932, À nous la liberté, by René Clair.
No.
But it deals with these two characters that are in jail. They escape. One of the two manages to he actually steals some money, and with that money he buys a record player, a phonoplay turntable, and he ends up creating this huge company selling records, and he becomes filthy rich, and he becomes a member of the bourgeois. And his friend who was in prison ends up being a hobo, like a chaplain character, and they end up meeting later. But the idea is that he came from the criminality, and he constructs this very respectable business, and he's respected in his community, and he has beauty around him. He lives in luxury. So it's like the Valentine character, very similar. I wonder whether Soderbergh or Dobbs had made that connection consciously or not.
Now, this is a fascinating thing, Dan. When you talk about the Peter Fonda character, his house is filled with these kind of mementos from the 1960s. So I almost got the sense that he has what the Marxists would call commodified the 1960s, that he's turned the 1960s into something to be sold back to people. And he has one of the best lines ever. Growing up in the 80s, I can appreciate this. When his girlfriend asks him, what were the 60s like? And he says, I'm going to do it wrong. I want to imagine a place that you had never been before, but when you were there, you spoke the language, and it felt like home. And then she goes, was that what the 60s like? And he's like, there were no 60s. There was 66 and part of 67. That was it.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the whole mythos for the 1960s is quickly dispelled. The only person who could possibly dispel that for us is Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda. But it's like, there were no 60s. It was just 66 and part of 67. After that, that was it.
You're right, Gordon, but we can also see that as a critique of the way any forms of nostalgia are commodified. Like now it's the 80s, right? The 80s, you get all these.
Now it's the 90s even, yeah.
Yeah, we're getting so I like the '90s. I think, my gosh, how can we be nostalgic with the '90s? It's not that long ago, but I guess for younger kids, the '90s is nostalgic. So
Yeah,
it's like it's a funny thing because is it a symbol of just a lack of creativity to sort of think about something new? We're always falling back on doing something again and again and again. So it's a cultural critique. You can't
it is a
criticize.
cultural
Yeah,
critique, but it's interesting how they're putting Terrence Stamp in there, who had his own credit as 1960s figure, and Peter Fonda, who, because of Easy Rider, I think, is the ultimate, him and Dennis Hopper, the ultimate 1960s counterculture figures. At least they were. So it really is a critique of the 1960s, maybe, or the commodification of the 1960s, or the nostalgia we have for the 1960s, a nostalgia for the past,
yeah.
which also is what the whole key of the murder was about.
Oh, go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I just want to also, because we're talking about the way that the different characters and actors play off of each other. If you look at Stamp and Peter Fonda, they're so different as well. I mean, one comes from the New World, one comes from the Old World. But in terms of the development of their own star persona, Terrence Stamp reached that point in his career where he was just going to skyrocket. He was ready to go into mega fame, and he was voted the most handsome or the most beautiful man in the world in the 60s. And then he just kind of takes a break. He takes a 5-year period where he just goes to India. He just doesn't make any films. He searches for his identity. So he sort of does the 60s thing, but in a different way, a more authentic way, if you will. He's going to look for the meaning of his life. He does meditation. He probably does a bit of drugs there too, but he spends a lot of time meeting gurus and and then he comes back with a whole different attitude, I guess, and mindset. And I think he brings that calm to the character as well, even though he's this volatile character. But there's moments of stillness in him, like when he's sitting in the beginning in the hotel room, when he's sitting on the plane. These kind of very meditative moments that the film really loves and enriches us with. So and Fonda is the other coin to the 60s, is the drugs, the much more in your face, visceral understanding of the 60s and stripping and loud music, as opposed to the more meditative side of the 60s. So they're mirroring each other in many ways.
Let me just pick up on a couple of things you said, Donato. First, with Stamp, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because right around the time that Stamp sort of took his little hiatus, that's when Malcolm McDowell sort of took over that role in Britain. And I've always sort of mixed them up in my mind, their careers, because they look vaguely similar, both younger and especially older. But I wanted to pick up on the point you talked about, that Rene Clair film, and it reminded me of Bresson's A Man Escaped. And that got me into mind of the later film that Bresson did that I've only seen parts of. I haven't seen the whole film. The one where one kid wants another kid to kill him. I forget the name of it. But it got me thinking about this film for a revenge film. Seems to dwell a lot, if not overtly within the diegesis of the film, on morality. And it's hard because all of these people have these consciences or lack of consciences beside them, whether it's the Leslie Ann Warren character, whether it's Guzman, or the lack being the Newman character. Do you think that, aside from being a character study, that this is also sort of a treatise on what is right and what is wrong, and how, say, the power and fame in Hollywood reflects that or refracts that? Either one of you want to jump in? Gordon, you look?
Well, what is right and what is wrong? I do think that there is a moral, in comparison to other Hollywood revenge films, usually if a wrong has been done and a man wants to seek revenge for that wrong, the audience, we're all for it. We're supposed to look at Dirty Harry. We're all for seeking revenge. I think that there is a moral dimension that's invested into the story that comes as a surprise towards the end when you realize the reasons for his daughter's murder. I don't think at any point, unless I'm mistaken, we're ever not supposed to want Terry Valentine getting killed. Where we even have this scene where Terrence Stamp imagines him being killed. He imagines shooting him twice. But I do think there's a moral equation being put in there. And I do think that the movie wants to question Artemis's desire for revenge. And I do think that Terrence Stamp's conclusion not to kill this man is a moral choice. And I think it's a choice that we're supposed to support. I don't think it's ambiguous at the end. I do want to go back to the scene where he meets Bill Duke. I think this is an interesting scene where he meets this corrupt, I'm not even sure corrupt, he meets this DEA agent, he meets this police officer who you think this scene's going to go one way, but it goes another way, where Bill Duke's like, look, man, if you want to kill this guy, there go my slippery hands again. Here's his house. Here's his address. If you want to kill him, that's fine with me. So I think Terrence Stamp's moral awakening at the end makes more sense because he's in a world that's amoral.
Right. That's a very good point. That's a great point you brought up.
That because he has, it means more that he doesn't kill him because he has him dead to rights.
Yeah.
He has him right there. So it means more. If everyone in this world is corrupt, it means more that Terrence Stamp is not.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not much I can add to that. I think you said it well, Gordon. I think the female characters are also, it's almost a cliche maybe to say they're the moral centers, but the daughter is the one who, tries to keep Valentine straight on the straight and narrow, right? She's the one who wants to find out what he's up to. Why, is his business legal or illegal? When she finds out that it's not, and she's the one who wants to stop him. So I think she's the moral center of the film, and it doesn't end well for her. So I think in the end, the father is upholding, in a sense, the daughter's values by trying to find out what happened to her, finding out, and then coming to peace with it. And that's where maybe the meditative part of Terrence Stamp, the person, is informing the character and is able to sort of step back and do the right thing.
Well, there's an interesting thing because there's another woman in Peter Fonda's life who's almost kind of this replacement of Jenny. Yeah. It's really strange because it does humanize that character a lot, but you almost get the sense that Jenny was just one of, several young women in his life.
There's a trophy.
She's another trophy in a house full of trophies. She's not stupid. I think another movie would have written her to be, an airhead. That's not happening here. She sees what's going on. When there's a firefight breaking out, she goes, why don't you just call the cops? She just had this girl like, we can't call the cops. It's a revenge movie. So there's almost this sense that she is a reflection of Jenny. That
she's Jenny 2.0.
Yeah. And she's the new Jenny. And it's just a nice little touch Lou Dobbs brings. And those conversations between her and Peter Fonda, I think, are very well written. I like that thing where he says, if you want to choose a girl's name, I told your parents you can't go wrong with a constellation. And I'm almost wondering, is she like an actress?
Yeah, that's right. She's the daughter of one of his friends and so that's a borderline incestuous thing there.
Not unusual for Hollywood, maybe. Maybe that kind of thing happens.
All right.
you date your friends' daughters, not to make any jokes about Woody Allen.
Yeah.
You date your friends' daughters. So that's what happens in Hollywood. So yeah.
So let's talk about the technical aspects again. We briefly touched on the editing. Is there anything you want to say about the soundtrack or the soundscaping there? Because it does open up with that blaring Who sound. And as I recall, I think most of the music that we hear is diegetic at the parties. Or am I wrong?
No, I remember when Peter Fonda's character is first introduced. It's introduced via montage and the song King Midas in reverse.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know who sang King Midas in reverse. I'm sorry.
I think it might be the Hollies. I'm not
Maybe
sure.
the Hollies, yeah.
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 King Midas in reverse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah, go ahead.
the soundtrack seems to have that same kind of division that I pointed out earlier in terms of popular film and art film. You have the source music or the nostalgia music, the pop music, whether it's the Who or the Hollies. Steppenwolf, I think, is in there as well. There's a lot of popular rock pop songs, and then there's the original score by a frequent collaborator, Cliff Martinez, who to me is one of the greatest contemporary composers. He does really, really beautiful, sort of melodic and but very ambient. So the music is kind of aleatory. It just kind of it doesn't really tell you exactly what you should be feeling, but it kind of gives you a certain mood. So I think a lot of the film seems to be patterned, on things that are very, very obvious. Where I'm the seeker, I'm someone looking for somebody, so you hear the seeker, and then there's other music that doesn't tell you at all what you should be feeling. So it really does match that kind of that duality that the film has between being very wanting to entertain in a very easy way and also want to challenge the audience with this more ambient music.
Yeah, the film itself, when it came out, though, for some reason, really didn't do particularly well. And it sort of languished for about 10, 12, 15 years before, in the last decade or so, people started, online reviewers started saying, wow, this is a really terrific film. Why do you think that the film did not do so well? Is it because Soderbergh had some earlier hits? But the year before it, he did Out of Sight, which is a good polished thriller, but I don't think is in a league with this film. Go ahead, Gordon.
There is a school of thought that says 1999 was one of the most significant years in cinema as of recently because of the films that came out in 1999. I can go off and name them, but I hopefully know what they are. That just might have gotten lost in the shuffle. Terrence Stamp was not a big marketable star, and I do know some reviews that called it boring, that weren't enthusiastic about it.
Well, here, Emmanuel Levy from Variety Magazine said that the film lacks secondary characters and subplots. But that's what we've been that's what we've been talking about for an hour almost.
Yeah, I don't know. This is why, don't forget critics. Just read me. I'll give you everything you want. No, but it's tough to kind of market and give people what the juice of the movie is in a 30-second ad. Mm-hmm. And I think if you go to the movie looking for a revenge film, you might be disappointed. If you're looking for a kind of, Liam Neeson kick butt movie. But I think but also the film he did before was Out of Sight. And if you ask me which I prefer, Out of Sight or Limey, the Limey by much more. And those had two very bankable stars in it, George Clooney and Jennifer Lopez. So I think that Steven Soderbergh's name as a director was not as powerful in 1999 as it maybe would be just a few years later. Because just a few years later, he would be an Academy Award-winning director.
Yeah, Aaron Brockovich, right?
And Traffic and Aaron Brockovich the same year. And if I remember correctly, his movies still, the Soderbergh movies that are most successful are the ones where it's him and the most famous actor is robbing a casino. Those are the ones that people want to see. Yeah, this more thoughtful stuff is always a tough sell with him.
Yeah, I think he's an interesting director because he does have I wouldn't say a love-hate relationship, but he likes to make popular films, but he also likes to challenge. So he's always flirted with genre cinema, and sometimes he gets it right in terms of uh, success, box office success, and sometimes he doesn't. But it doesn't mean that those films that don't succeed are not interesting, right? So if you look at his filmography, The Limey, I think, is actually compared to something like Solaris that we make a few years later, which is much more on the art side, not as arty as the original by Tarkovsky, which is a masterpiece, but it still is really very slow, very dreamy, very moody. Doesn't give you any of the high tech science fiction stuff you usually get. So he missed with that one. The film tanked at the box office. Ocean's 11, the ones that you were mentioning, Gordon, there he got it right. He was able to sort of make a popular heist film and still have his artistic touches in it, but those are very secondary to the crux of those films.
Ironically, Dan, I actually went over his entire filmography earlier this year. With the exception of one or two, I've seen every single Soderbergh film out there. And even going over his filmography, he's a tough director to pin down. Even those signatures that you would see in a movie like Ocean's 11 are not to be found in Contagion or something like that. Or even if you go back to his early work, he did some highly formal movies like, I don't know if you've ever seen Kafka. Yeah. Kafka is a highly formalized movie. Or even something like King of the Hill, which doesn't really have any, it seems very naturalistic. And then you get from that stuff to stuff like Haywire and Side Effects. And he did a biography of Che Guevara.
Well, Full Frontal. Full Frontal is an oddball film.
Yeah, Full Frontal, Sex, Lies, and Videotape. I mean, he is all over the place. If you want to see a crazy film by him, if you remember, Gus Van Sant took Hitchcock's Psycho and remade it. Soderbergh actually took Gus Van Sant's Psycho and remade that. And what he did is he made it black and white again. He made it black and white, and he removed any scene where Vince Vaughn is talking. And what he does is he remakes the movie, he re-edits it, and puts Hitchcock's version and Gus Van Sant's version in black and white together into one movie and calls it Psychos. And he just cuts back and forth between his black and white Gus Van Sant one and the Hitchcock original. So he just has these crazy, and then there's even stuff like Magic Mike that he does. So he's all over the map, and it's hard to even pin him down if you want to do the auteurist reading, because what are the components of a Soderbergh movie? It depends on the Soderbergh film you're watching. And the thing that always strikes me is his films have really strong cinematography. He is a cinematographer, I think, and he will use those filters. If you've seen Traffic, he will use those filters in a deliberately narrative style. So that's what I think happens here in The Limey and in his other movies. But then there are other movies that he's made where the cinematography doesn't seem that important at all. So he's just a tough record to pin down. And he has 40-something movies. The guy works like a maniac.
So I've not seen as many of the movies as you, Gordon. You had earlier, before we did this final segment, was talking about the rank. Of the 8, 9, 10 movies of Soderbergh's I've seen, to me, while Erin Brockovich and Traffic and Sex, Lies, and Videotapes and a couple of others are very good films, to me, this is, from what I've seen, clearly his pinnacle.
It's best. It's his best. If it's not his best, it should be in the conversation about his best. It's his most accomplished, and I'm going to sound like a real Luddite here. I love the fact, look at how much he does with just 80 minutes. This movie is 80 minutes. It is not a long film at all. Every film I see nowadays is a half hour too long.
Yeah.
Even the ones I like, they're too damn long. This is 80 minutes and it's so dense.
Yeah.
There's so much character. There's so much dialogue. Could they have added a scene or two? Yeah, but it wouldn't have made the movie greater, I think. It's pretty rich. Characterization, acting, plot, tension, humor. All that stuff is here in 80 minutes. Damn. Film students should be watching The Limey. It really is a good movie.
How about you, Donato? Where do you place this in his canon? You've probably seen more than me.
I think I've seen a bit more. I haven't seen Behind the Candelabra, which is the Liberace biopic, which I've heard a lot of good things about.
Pretty good.
Yeah, but then I think he's a director that likes to experiment a lot, and I think he's kind of like Hitchcock was that way too. But Hitchcock was in a different era where there was the studio system, there was more control. But he really like Unsane. I just remember that film that I saw of his from 2018, which is a really odd film. It's kind of like this thriller / horror film where he just basically wanted to shoot it with, I think, an iPhone with a really extreme wide angle.
With iPhones, yeah.
Yeah, with an extreme wide angle lens. So the whole image is distorted, and it's about this woman that gets mistakenly placed into an asylum, and is she crazy or isn't she crazy? No one believes she's going crazy. That idea. And it's a very enjoyable film, but it's really slight. It's, he just did it off the cuff, where something like The Limey, you feel there's a lot more thought behind it. It's not just an idea, an experiment. I think Contagion is that way too. I think maybe because of COVID, the pandemic, it's become one of the number one hit. I think it was viewed the most in the last year than any other film on Netflix or wherever it was playing. So I think the Contagion is up there for his great films. And I mean, the Ocean's 11 films as well. Some of them are really very smart, very self-aware, very tightly structured. The design of those films are really, really special. But I think to me, yeah, I had The Limey up at the top for sure.
A question I wanted to ask both of you, since you probably both know more about the stuff behind the films. I saw an interview, and I think it was a video interview about 8-10 years ago with Soderbergh when he supposedly gave up filmmaking, and he had told people that he was planning originally, if the film had done well, to do a sequel to this. And I was wondering if you ever heard that, because to me, it would have been one of the most superfluous. I don't see how a sequel could have come even close. Did either of you know anything about that?
I haven't heard of that, but you can almost view The Limey as a sequel itself to Poor Cow.
Yeah.
It's already a sequel, but I have not heard of a Limey sequel.
Well, the reason I give it credence, is you had mentioned about all these ideas that were originally in the script that were tossed away. So I'm wondering if he was thinking about maybe doing that. I was just wondering. I didn't know.
Oh, well, that happens sometimes. To me, when filmmakers say that, that means that they're not entirely satisfied with the finished product that they made. Uh-huh. But as far, he always talks about retiring, and I hear this from filmmakers like, I'm going to retire. It's like, then you realize that you're one of a handful of people in the entire world that get to make movies. Yeah. You quickly come back. Yeah. I'm a Miyazaki fan. Miyazaki looks to retire. It's like, yeah, we'll see about that. Yeah. Daniel Day-Lewis says, that's it. I'm retired. Like, yeah, we'll see about that. Yeah. What are you going to do? Go home and stare at a wall for 20 years? No, yeah. You're a creative person. If you're a creative person, you like to create. Yeah. And because of streaming now, a lot of these guys are getting offered projects that they could not do before. Yeah. A lot of like Apple TV and Netflix are going to and say, hey, that project you tried 5 years ago, we'll give you $100 million. Do it for us. So we'll see. Maybe we'll see that Limey sequel. The Limey Returns.
Yeah. Yeah, but he'll be a geriatric this time. Totally.
Yeah, he'll be in a wheelchair. Yeah. I just saw Terrence Stamp. Edgar Wright has a new movie called Last Night in Soho. And, yeah, Terrence Stamp is in that one too. So Terrence Stamp got a little career resurgence from this too.
So
Yeah.
go ahead, Donato.
No Sudden Move is another one. I just realized I'd seen that one, and that's interesting because it's a bit of it's in that same ballpark. It's crime, it's heist, so it's a bit of a mixture of the Ocean's 11 and the Limey.
When I was doing my research on his filmography, the one thing that kept coming up was that actors love Soderbergh.
Yeah.
Apparently, he's very good at directing actors.
Right.
So if you're looking for quality, his authorial signature, it could be he's just good at directing actors. You know, there are some people like Hitchcock who would just say, you know, what do you call an actor? Cattle. You just do it. But apparently, according to Matt Damon, according to Benicio del Toro, I love Benicio del Toro. If he's not in a Soderbergh movie, I'm not interested in him because every other movie he does is boring, and he's one of the only guys that knows how to make Benicio interesting in his movies. It's like Quentin Tarantino was the only guy who knows how to write for Sam Jackson, if you ask me. Sam Jackson is only interesting in a Quentin Tarantino movie. So Benicio del Toro is only interesting when he's in Soderbergh movies. The guy knows how to direct. Same with Matt Damon. The guy knows how to direct actors. And I don't know if that he used to be an actor. He acted in a movie called Schizopolis. And Dan, if you want to see a crazy, crazy movie that makes no goddamn sense at all, watch Schizopolis. But yeah, apparently he's just very good with actors, and that's why he can get so many of them in his movies.
That's interesting. That could be like we're struggling to find a style or an ism that could fit Soderbergh, and he seems like he is a director that more than most directors gives equal weight and value to the cinematography. So his films are always, except for a few exceptions that Gordon mentioned, that don't seem to feature an incredible thought process behind the look of the film. You know, they're dealing with filters, colorization, they're dealing with lenses. So he's very good with the look of the film, but he's also very, very good with performance. And oftentimes, when you get directors who are very good with the camera and with the visuals, you know, the acting sort of seems to have to fit into that design. If you think of someone like Stanley Kubrick, his films are great, but you know, the performances are very much determined by the style of the film, in terms of the hitting the marks and paying attention to what was happening around you. So maybe he's one of those directors that is equally thoughtful when it comes to at a very high level. I'm saying, not, you know, everyone of course wants the film to look good and be well acted, but he's at a very high level. He can be conceptually interesting in terms of the visuals and also in terms of the performances.
I'm looking at his filmography, and he does do a lot of the camera operation himself. I don't know if that's typical, but he will be the guy holding the camera, shooting the movie. So that might be unique as well.
So Gordon, let's wrap this up. Why do you think Limey is a great film, and why would you recommend it to someone who hasn't seen it before?
I think The Limey is an intelligent movie. I think The Limey is a well-visualized movie. And I think The Limey takes the revenge film, typically the revenge film that we see, and breaks it up into a million pieces, shatters it, and makes the audience put it back together. I love when a film makes the audience do some work. And I do think you have to do some work in thinking about The Limey.
And same question to you, Donato. If someone hasn't seen this before, why should they see The Limey, and why is it great?
Well, I guess I go back the idea of nostalgia, which is really so hot right now. I think if you go back and you watch this film, you'll get a sense of someone using nostalgia, but you know, for the right reasons in terms of it servicing this particular story. So the way he casts his characters, the use of music, the genre, the way he plays off with genre films from the 60s and also gangster films, British gangster films from the 80s and 90s. So it's nostalgia, but really done to service this wonderful, wonderful performance by we know who, Terrence Stamp. To me, that's what I come back to all the time. Is I want to watch Terrence Stamp. He's just so cool. He's just so cool.
Well,
so to me, it's the cool factor.
Thanks for both of you. I'll link to both of you, and I'll link to your page now, Gordon. I see you have a web page at your university, so I'll link to both of them. And thank you for spending an hour or more talking about the Limey.
You tell them I'm coming.
Yeah, tell them we're coming.
I'm fucking coming.